Hello, and welcome back to American Environmental History. This is week 8, or chapter 8, which I call the Green Revolution. And when I say that, I'm thinking of the early Green Revolution in the 19th and the early 20th century. Later on, there's a guy by the name of Norman Borlaug who uses that term to talk about his expansion of industrial agriculture out into the developing world. And we will talk about that later in the semester. But today, I want to talk about 3 chemicals that basically make the world as we know it possible. And those are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So to begin, U.S. history often seems to be kind of a straightforward story of expansion westward, from early colonies on the East Coast to the frontier. After a revolution that was motivated partly by the colonists' resistance to the British Crown's restrictive proclamation that had divided the country between the areas they could settle and then a Western Indian reserve on the other side of the Appalachians. After they had gotten past that with the Revolutionary War, the citizens of this new nation took advantage of the opportunities provided by the Northwest Ordinance, and then later by the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican-American War, and the Oregon Treaty to seek their fortunes on the frontier. Expansion was achieved by hardworking farmers, ranchers, and miners on the countryside, enabled by urban wage workers and businesses from the East, and also increasingly from these new Western cities like Chicago that we looked at last week. These pioneers, of course, were also aided by capital from Eastern and overseas financial markets, and by improving transportation networks that we've already looked at, and by these Eastern city workers who were consumers for the products of their fields and their forests and their mines. But not all the significant movement in American history was east to west. The growth of eastern cities depended on resources acquired from the frontier. So the flow of raw materials, like farm products and timber and minerals, and we'll explore minerals more later on in the semester as well. This flow from west to east was also vitally important to the nation's growth. The ideal of manifest destiny in American history is as much about securing access to these resources as it is about planting the stars and stripes from sea to shining sea. And sometimes important changes actually originated in the West and expanded eastward. The expansion and growth of both the West and the East depended on the ability of farmers to continue producing food for the nation's growing population and also for export. The biggest single factor in the continuing farm bonanza was soil fertility. In the 1840s, a German chemist by the name of Justus von Liebig discovered that the chemicals nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium were essential to plant growth. Farm soils naturally lose fertility unless fields are given time to regenerate between crop plantings or soil amendments are added. Liebig announced that instead of leaving fields fallow for years between plantings, farmers could actually amend the soil with the chemicals that the plants needed. And we'll take a look at each of these chemicals, beginning with the element often considered, and rightly considered, the most important thing that you can put in the soil, nitrogen. During a crucial period when America's commercial farmers were becoming increasingly responsible for feeding a growing nation of people who didn't farm, nitrogen came from the West. When early settlers cut and burned forests to build farms, which they did from really the East Coast to the Mississippi River, because that was all old growth forest. The thin soils of these forest floors received an initial productivity boost from the leaf mulch that had been piling for generations or centuries under these trees, and also from the ashes of the burned trees. This fertility was exhausted in a few years unless the farmer either rotated between crops and pasture or added manure to the soil. Prairie soils that settlers found farther west were deeper and more fertile than the eastern forest soils. This is a map of the prairies. This is on the On the right, the dark green is the tall grass prairie, then there's an intermediate prairie, and then there's a short grass prairie farther west. Tall grass prairies grew between the Canadian border and Texas in that entire region. And as the name suggests, some of their grasses grew 6 to 9 feet tall. When Laura Ingalls' parents in the little house books tell her not to stray too far onto the prairie, it's because they're afraid of losing her in the tall grass. So in addition to being tall, these prairies were deep. After millennia of growth and decay, this prairie vegetation had left a layer of organic matter or humus up to 10 feet deep. And the roots of perennial grasses took advantage of this depth. They drew nutrients and water from well below the surface. When settlers arrived with their new John Deere cast steel moldboard plows, they only managed to turn over the top foot or two of this organic layer. But even so, the prairie offered some of the richest soils that American settlers had ever seen. Western farmers and settlers on the prairie rode to their families and friends back east, boasting of the land and the great yields that they got from farming it. In the long run, of course, even the most fertile soils will be depleted after years and years of growing annual crops that don't return any nutrients to the soil. Smaller farms were able to spread manure from livestock, but as their cultivated fields grew from a few acres to a few hundred acres, many farmers found there just wasn't enough manure to spread. Commercial farmers who specialized in growing wheat or growing corn for the market began planting their fields with these cash crops every year rather than rotating grain planting with pasture planting and letting animals graze on them that would return at least some manure to the land. A new source of soil fertility was needed to prevent the agricultural balloon from deflating. And the first source was alfalfa, a crop that farmers at the time called chili clover. Now, it has long been known that in addition to adding and spreading manure, that planting legumes is an effective way of adding nitrogen to soils. Although nitrogen is the most common element in the Earth's atmosphere, making up 78% of the air that we breathe, atmospheric nitrogen is very stable and it's unreactive. Plants can't use nitrogen until it has been converted into nitrogen oxides or nitrates or ammonia. Legumes have evolved a symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria, which live in nodules on the plant's roots and break the bonds of atmospheric nitrogen. So very effective. When legumes are grown on a field and then plowed under, the nitrogen that accumulates in the plants enters the soil and becomes available for the next crop. One of the most effective legume crops used as green manure is alfalfa. Alfalfa is actually a Eurasian plant, and Siberian horse tribes began feeding it to their animals over 3,000 years ago. Cortez and Pizarro brought alfalfa to Mexico and Peru in the early 1500s, and the aggressive species quickly spread across Central and especially South America. When English colonists planted alfalfa when they came to the east coast of the United States, they called it lucerne, and the plant did rather poorly in the cool, acidic soils of the original Atlantic colonies. After this early failure, the plant was forgotten by American farmers. But a Chilean miner introduced alfalfa to California during the gold rush. During the gold rush in the 1850s, Californians brought a lot of Chileans as workers from South America because the Chileans were very experienced in mining. And the climates of Chile and California are nearly identical. A lot of the Chilean countryside and a lot of California is kind of a Mediterranean climate. So this alfalfa that they brought along with them thrived. And this plant that the Californians called chili clover spread across western pastures. It renewed the soil, and it provided 10 times as much nutrition as regular grasses for the dairy herds of California, which were already growing in the 1850s. So impressed by alfalfa's success in California in the early 1850s, the U.S. Patent Office actually mailed out thousands of packets of alfalfa seed to farmers across the country. Alfalfa planting spread eastward from California as the plant was quickly adopted by farmers in Utah, and then Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska. Today, the Chilean import is so common in American fields that almost no one remembers that it was not a native species. But some farmers lacked the patience to rotate cropping with pasture, or even to plant a cover crop in the winters. And they were unwilling to accept the idea that a significant part of their acreage should be fallow each year. They preferred to amend their soils rather than waiting for the fertility to regenerate naturally. But as I mentioned, very few farmers had access to enough manure to supplement all their soil once they were into commercial agriculture. The first commercial fertilizers were made from guano, which is the droppings of seabirds, of cormorants and pelicans living off the coast of the western nations of South America. Guano comes from the Quechua Indian word guanu, which means any excrement that's used as a soil additive for farming. The advantage that guano had over locally available manures was that it was dry, it was light, and it was highly concentrated. Natives in the Andes have mined guano on the coast and the islands for at least 1,500 years, according to archaeologists. Spanish colonial records noted that Inca rulers considered protecting the cormorants that were the main source of guano to be so important that disturbing the birds' nests was a capital offense. Guano was carried from the coast up into the Andes on the backs of llamas for use on those terraced farms that we saw surrounding cities in the highlands like Machu Picchu. So although they're surrounded by the ocean, these islands off the western coast of South America are arid. It hardly ever rains there. So like the deserts that they face on the mainland, some experience no rainfall at all. Seabirds like cormorants and pelicans have lived on these islands by the millions for thousands of years. Over that time, they've left literally mountains of droppings, which, due to the lack of rain, have simply piled up. The guano contains 8 to 16% nitrogen, 8 to 12% phosphorus, and 2 to 3% potassium, which makes it an excellent fertilizer without any mixing and without needing to be diluted. It simply needs to be chopped off the mountain, ground up, transported to where people want to use it, and spread on fields. The Prussian explorer Alexander von Humboldt, who was a famous explorer, he climbed a lot of mountains in South America. He also discovered the ocean current that's named after him now, the Humboldt Current in the Pacific. And he visited the new president, Thomas Jefferson, on his way back from this visit to South America in 1802. He publicized, when he got back to Europe, he publicized guano's value as fertilizer throughout Europe. And seeing a lucrative business opportunity, Europeans and Americans fell on this area in what literally became a guano rush. And by the middle of the century, several nations were mining guano and shipping it on ships back to their farmers. Excuse me. And to do this, they enlisted the work of Chinese peasants in a Pacific labor system, which historians are starting to find has a lot of similarities with slavery in the Atlantic world. Although the Chinese workers were technically free, many had been tricked into labor contracts that promised them work in California in the gold camps or later on the railroads. And once they reached the Guano Islands, they were very unhappy that they had been duped, but there was no way off. This image here is a mountain of guano being mined by those little guys there. You can't really tell, but they're Chinese workers. Over 100,000 Chinese workers were imported to the islands in the second half of the 19th century. Guano was actually so profitable that the U.S. government passed the Congress passed a Guano Islands Act in 1856. The law provided an incentive for American sailors to claim any undefended lands that nobody had planted a flag on that had guano. So if you found an island while you were tooling around the Pacific Ocean and it didn't obviously have somebody's flag on it, you could claim it, and the discoverer would get exclusive rights to the guano that was recovered. Over 100 islands were claimed under the Guano Islands Act, including parts of the Hawaiian chain, Midway Atoll, which became very important in World War II, and part of American Samoa, and then several more islands that are still disputed with Colombia. The Guano Islands off the western coast of South America, for what's now Peru, were so valuable that 2 wars were fought over them. Chile and Peru teamed up to fight Spain in the Chincha Islands War of 1864 to 1866, when the Spanish Empire was trying to sort of reinvigorate its claim on South America after losing all of these nations that became free. Then, when Spain's claim had been successfully set aside, Chile took the Guano Islands, most of them away from Peru, along with the nitrate fields of the Atacama Desert, which we'll talk about next, in the War of the Pacific from 1879 to 1883. So this is the Atacama Desert, the driest place in the world. After about 1870, guano was overtaken as a source of nitrogen by these nitrate-rich desert soils called caliche. These soils were discovered in this Atacama Desert, a region that was partly in Chile, partly in Peru, and partly in Bolivia. All 3 nations discovered this nitrate at about the same time and rushed to extract and process the caliche. And then Chile challenged its rivals for the nitrate fields. So Chile's victory in the War of the Pacific extended its border northwards to encompass really the entire Atacama Desert, including all of the coastal territory that had once belonged to Bolivia. Many ethnic Bolivians who still live around the port city of Arica still dream of throwing off the Chilean control and winning their country access again to the Pacific Ocean. Defeating its northern neighbors in the War of the Pacific made Chile the undisputed power on the west coast of the Americas and generated an economic boom for Chile. The nitrate that Chile monopolized was valuable both as fertilizer and as a key ingredient of explosives and munitions. But mining and processing nitrate for Chile from this desert soil was very expensive, and it required more capital than just digging guano had. So Chile attracted British investors, and soon a bunch of joint ventures began shipping millions of tons of nitrate per year out of this South American desert. Production grew steadily until 1914, when World War I created new incentives for, especially for Britain's enemies, to find an alternative to this caliche nitrate. During World War I, Germany was prevented from getting any access to this nitrate, so they had to find another source of nitrate for making explosives. And that's when this guy Fritz Haber comes in. Haber was a German Jewish chemist who in 1911 developed the high-pressure method for extracting nitrogen from the atmosphere that is used today to produce nearly all of the nitrogen that we use in industry and in agriculture. Karl Bosch, working for the German company BASF, scaled up Haber's laboratory experiment to industrial production. So between the two of them, this process is known as the Haber-Bosch process. In 1914, BASF produced 20 tons a day of nitrate from the atmosphere for the war effort. After the war, production of synthetic nitrate fertilizer quickly cut prices by more than half, and the annual Chilean caliche shipments dropped to less than a third of their pre-war levels, which had been about a volume of 2.5 million tons per year. Haber and Bosch were actually each jointly awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918. The Haber-Bosch process requires not only extremely high temperatures and pressures to extract the atmospheric nitrogen, but also a great deal of energy. About 5% of the world's production of natural gas every year is required to produce the about 500 million tons of ammonia that the world makes annually. But the results have been spectacular. The application of concentrated nitrogen onto farm fields increased production even over the yields that had been achieved using guano and nitrate, causing a global explosion in crop yields known as the Green Revolution, especially since World War II. By 2010, the Haber-Bosch process produced 133 million tons of ammonia annually, about 3/4 of which was applied as fertilizer. The rest of it, of course, still went into making explosives. Corn yields increased fivefold, and other staple crops like rice saw increases of 3 or 4 times. The historian of technology, Vaclav Smil, estimates that if crop yields had stayed at the levels that they were at in 1900, by the year 2000, farm fields would have needed to cover at least half of the ice-free land in the world in order to feed the world's current population, rather than just the 15% that they now occupy. Another way of putting Smil's point is that nearly half the people alive today would probably starve without the Haber-Bosch process. But Fritz Haber's story has a kind of a sad element as well. Although he won the Nobel Prize and worldwide admiration for his work leading to nitrogen fertilizers, Fritz Haber's legacy is clouded with tragedy. In addition to the nitrate that Germany needed for its munitions in World War I, Fritz Haber's other contribution to the German war effort were the chlorine-based chemical warfare agents, the poison gas that he used against Allied troops, and also a cyanide-based pesticide called Zyklon A that was the direct predecessor of the poison used against prisoners in the concentration camps during World War II. Haber's wife, who's pictured here, Clara Immerwahr, was also a scientist and was the first woman ever to receive a PhD from the University of Breslau in Germany. Immerwahr killed herself with her husband's service pistol when she discovered that he was just coming back in April 1915 from supervising the first successful use of chlorine gas on Allied troops in the Battle of Ypres. Their son, Hermann, who was just a young boy when she killed herself, she was about 45 years old. Hermann emigrated to the US, but then ultimately committed suicide himself in 1946 after discovering that his father's other invention, Zyklon, had been used to kill millions of their fellow German Jews. Fritz Haber, I guess luckily, didn't live to see Zyklon B used in the concentration camps. He died while moving to Palestine in 1934. The Haber-Bosch process is an effective way to synthesize nitrogen, as long as energy costs remain low. But it's not the only way to make nitrogen fertilizer. As I mentioned earlier, soil bacteria and symbiotic microbes living on legumes, on alfalfa, on beans, even on clover, can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere without any additional energy inputs, just sunlight. And there are several other chemical processes that also can be applied on industrial scales. Some of these processes are much less energy intensive than the Haber-Bosch. For example, a hydroelectric plant in Norway has used its surplus energy to make ammonia for fertilizer from 1911 to 1971, for 60 years, using processes that had actually been developed before Fritz Haber made his discovery. But in spite of these alternatives, most of the nitrogen used in commercial fertilizer today is currently produced through the Haber-Bosch process. As a result, Fertilizer prices tend to follow natural gas prices, and ammonia-based fertilizers will probably continue to be made using these high energy processes until energy costs rise substantially. The second element that Liebig discovered was crucial to plant growth was phosphorus. Unlike nitrogen, which makes up 78% of the Earth's atmosphere, phosphorus is a mineral. Traditional agriculture recycled phosphorus by returning manure to the fields as fertilizer. During the Green Revolution, most of the phosphorus applied by the world's farmers has been in the form of superphosphate, which is a concentrate manufactured from a raw material called phosphate rock. That's what you see in these train cars here. Phosphate rock is a sedimentary mixture of minerals deposited in earlier geological eras at the bottoms of ancient oceans. Guano is also rich in concentrated phosphate, and after the Atacama Desert became a main source of nitrates, a lot of the guano remaining on the Pacific Islands was used to produce phosphate fertilizer. The deposits currently used to make fertilizer contain about 30% phosphorus. Although mineral phosphorus is plentiful in the Earth's crust, known deposits of this sedimentary phosphate rock are finite. Estimates of the concentrated phosphorus that remains vary, depending on assumptions about yet to be developed technologies for discovering and recovering the mineral. Sometimes scientists believe that phosphorus production may peak around the year 2030 and then decline as exploitable reserves are exhausted. Like nitrogen, inexpensive and plentiful phosphorus has boosted crop yields greatly. 80% of the phosphate rock mined each year goes to produce fertilizer. Phosphorus shortages would create serious threats to world food supply, which could impact global security. But since phosphorus is still available in animal and human waste, a shift back toward applying manures to agricultural fields could reduce demand for superphosphate. Recognizing the growing value of the chemicals contained in our own waste, some urban sewage treatment operations have actually begun producing concentrated phosphorus fertilizers from city sewer sludge. But phosphorus is thought of as a strategic element. Potassium, the third vital plant nutrient, is actually named after the potash that we talked about earlier, that early American colonists made from the trees that they burned to clear their fields. Ashes were soaked in water, and the water was then evaporated in cast iron pots that give potash its name, to produce lye, which is potassium hydroxide, and potash, which is a mixture of potassium chloride and potassium carbonate. Wood ashes would yield about 10% potash by weight, and by clearing a few acres of trees each year as they expanded their cultivation, settlers could also produce a product that they could sell for cash. The first patent actually ever issued by the United States government in 1790 was for a new apparatus and process for making potash. Like phosphorus, commercial potassium fertilizers are manufactured from sedimentary deposits mined at the sites of ancient inland seas. Current world production is actually dominated by two cartels, but the known reserves are so much more than those of phosphorus. They're like 300 times annual production. So the element is not currently considered to be strategic. One of the problems associated with using concentrated soluble hydrogen and phosphorus and potassium, or NPK, in agriculture is that the uptake by crops is less than 50%. In the old days of 10-foot deep prairie soils, this would not have been a problem. Organic matter binds elemental nutrients. And then as it decays slowly, it releases the nutrient chemicals into the soil gradually over many seasons. The deep root systems of perennial grasses and the other things that lived in those organic soils stored nutrients in biomass. And the chemistry of organic soils includes microscopic insect, bacterial, and fungal life forms that thrived in those soils and held on to the rest of these nutrients that the plants didn't take up immediately. However, in the shallow, plowed fields of modern farms, the root systems of annual crops aren't deep enough to catch and hold nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And much of the soil life that once thrived in farm fields and pastures has been eliminated by pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides, leaving soils more or less sterile. In spite of the additional food produced to support growing world populations, the Green Revolution has been criticized by environmentalists for ignoring the problems created by fertilizer runoff. Excess agricultural fertilizer contributes nearly half of the nutrients that are currently poisoning American streams and rivers. Fertilizers entering the watershed encourage algal blooms. So they encourage the growth of algae. And when these mats of single-celled plants die and drop to the bottom of rivers and ponds and lakes and oceans, the decaying algae traps all of the oxygen, the dissolved oxygen in the water, creating hypoxic dead zones. The rivers that lead to the Mississippi and dump nitrate fertilizers into the Gulf of Mexico have created a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which has shrunk from its peak in 2002. It was 8,500 square miles in 2002. Shrank a little in the years after that, but then in the 2010s has been expanding again. And this excess fertilizer continues to flow down the Mississippi into the ocean. Here is a video from the government agency NOAA about what that dead zone looked like a couple years ago. In America, the early Green Revolution began with the use of guano and then potash and then nitrate, and that all led to a bonanza of farming and the extension of agriculture oftentimes onto marginal lands. And then nitrate from the caliche fields, and then ultimately ammonia from the Haber-Bosch process expanded production even further. And then the Russian Revolution and World War I at the beginning of the 20th century reduced European farm production and drove up the price of American grain on international markets. And then marginal high plain grazing lands like those in western Kansas and Nebraska and Oklahoma and northwest Texas all of a sudden looked attractive to farmers and were put under the plow. Cropland in this western region, the region that was the light green area on that map of the prairies, doubled between 1900 and 1920, and then tripled again between 1925 and 1930. Now, plowing fields for annual corn and wheat planting is such a common farming practice nowadays that it seems normal to us. On the high plains, though, perennial grasses had evolved to find water deep in the soil and to hold on to it. They had super deep roots, and plowing cut those roots and exposed the soil to the sun and the wind. So, two ways we're losing moisture here. We're not finding it deep down because we've cut the roots, we're planting shallow-rooted plants, and we're exposing soil. The generations of American farmers who had been taught to depend on plentiful commercial fertilizers had forgotten the value of humus, of soil organic matter. Since Justus von Liebig had focused their attention on soil chemistry in the 1840s, most soil scientists had also been promoting the idea that chemical nutrients were the way to go and were the important thing, and that soil itself was just kind of an inert medium. It was just a substrate that held the roots and prevented plants from falling over. Although the prairies that settlers discovered when they moved westward had been rich in living organic material, the farms that people built on these original soils relied on imported chemicals rather than on the nutrients produced by biological activity in the soil. Many farmers even burned off the stems and stalks left after each harvest. And then the soil blew away. The western edge of the prairie, that light green area on that earlier map, was actually a completely different ecosystem from the eastern edge by the Great Lakes, the tall grass prairies that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about in the Little House books. But the change in climate was very gradual. Although many farmers moving west to convert these high plains rangelands into cultivated fields failed to notice it, rainfall was much scarcer and the wind blew much harder. Those who did notice it were mollified by assurances from experts that, quote unquote, rain would follow the plow. The idea was that as farmers opened up these soils and moisture evaporated from them, it would condense into clouds right above, and then it would fall as rain. Of course, the wind was blowing, so that didn't really happen. This was just boosterism and wishful thinking. Rain didn't follow plows. Between 1933 and 1935, drought struck the area. Or more likely, the area returned to its normal conditions after a couple of years of a little bit more rain. And this little bit more rain had been taken by hopeful farmers and optimistic boosters as the region's permanent climate. So over 500,000 people were left homeless when their topsoil literally blew away. In a single storm, beginning on November 11th, 1933, topsoil from Oklahoma was blown all the way to Chicago, where over 12 million pounds of it fell on the city like snow. Like alfalfa, guano, and nitrate in the 19th century, America's topsoil was traveling from west to east, ironically. On Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935, dust storms were reported from the Canadian border to Texas. Newspaper reporters throughout the affected area wrote and posted wire service stories that they could not see 5 feet away. They couldn't see their hands in some cases in the blowing dust. The agricultural disaster that became known as the Dust Bowl caused an exodus from this high plains region that should never have been put under the plow. But the disaster was not just agricultural. 500,000 people lost their homes. But of the 116,000 refugee families that were surveyed on their way into California, these people who Californians called the Okies and who the book The Grapes of Wrath was written about, of the 116,000 refugee families that were surveyed, only 4 out of 10 were farm families. And a full third of the heads of these households who fled from Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska and Texas were white-collar professionals. That's because when the farms blew away, the towns were lost as well. The whole region was wiped out. Alarmingly, less than a century later, the lessons of history have been forgotten, and much of the Dust Bowl is again under the plow. The wheat fields of Kansas and Texas and Oklahoma and Colorado produced 411 million bushels of grain in 1933, just before the drought began. The Dust Bowl cut production by 3/4 to about 100 million bushels. But by 2012, the region was once again producing 700 million bushels of wheat. This time, farmers had taken advantage of irrigation. So there are 2 maps here. The one on the left is the map of the area that was worst hit by the Dust Bowl. The map on the right is the Ogallala Aquifer. The Ogallala is one of the world's largest aquifer. It's the biggest underground water supply in the Americas. It stretches from South Dakota to West Texas. Farmers have been drawing water from it for over 50 years using deep wells and center pivot irrigation. But the aquifer, which was charged with water over centuries, before American farmers arrived, is not an unlimited resource. Sections of West Texas and Kansas have already run out of water, and irrigation is still accelerating. In just 7 years, between 2001 and 2008, farmers used about a third of the water that was taken out of the aquifer during the entire 20th century. The rate of depletion far exceeds the rate of recharge. In most of these dark gray areas on the map, the rate of depletion is greater than 2 feet of water level in the aquifer per year, and the rate of recharge is about 1 inch per year. The rate of depletion far exceeds the rate of recharge everywhere on the aquifer, even in the occasional rainy years. The aquifer, if it's emptied and irrigation becomes impossible again on the high plains, American grain production will be reduced by 700 million bushels per year. Farmers will have no choice but to replant the perennial prairie grasses and convert the plains back to rangeland if they hope to prevent the soil from blowing away again. The question is, will American agribusiness change willingly and thoughtfully before the crisis, or will it react out of desperation after the crisis strikes? That's all for today. In the future, we will take another look at agriculture and the Green Revolution as it is exported to the developing world. But I hope this was helpful. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again next time.